welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I know everyone's calendar is very full at this time of the semester, so we appreciate you being here. Welcome to the Global Scholars Lecture that is co-hosted between the Center for International Higher Education and also our colleagues here at the Office of Global Engagement. And I should also say as part of International Education Weeks that's going on here all month at Boston College. We don't just do a week, we do a month. So welcome to part of that program as well. It's really my pleasure to welcome Dr. Zama Mthombeni, who's been with us for the last 3 months as Hans de Wit Fellow in the Center for International Higher Education. For those of you who aren't familiar with this program, it's a program that we launched 3 years ago, well, 3 scholars ago, maybe 4 years. That's a little bit of not total alignment there. Yeah, but we launched in sort of honor of our former director, Hans de Wit, and with some seed funding from World Education Services to allow a mobility experience for a promising early career researcher to spend some time at the center. And Zama is our third to be here with us. At the time that we met Zama, she was finishing her doctoral studies and working at the HSRC in South Africa, and now she is a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And we're delighted to have had this time with her for the last few months, and we're mostly excited to hear a little bit about her research today. I understand we've got 2 microphones going, so just give me a minute while I pass them on to Zama, but please join me in welcoming Zama. Thank you so much. I'm going to put this to you right here.
All right. Good afternoon to all. Thank you so much for taking your time to listen to me. I think what I'll be presenting today, I'm not sure if it's a lecture or a TEDx talk, so it's just in between. What I have in front of you is a project that I'm working on. It's a book project. This is not a book launch because the book is still in process. We still have some chapters missing, but I just want to present rather the thinking, the epistemological work behind the book, and also give you some snippets of what we are finding as we're going through a lot of chapters and what is the contribution of the book. I hope that's clear. So I would like to start off with a list of key terms that you're going to hear me using so that you are not saying, what is this lady talking about, right? So you're going to hear me speak about epistemological injustice, embodied epistemology, situated epistemology, and just epistemology as a word, how we know and what we know. So the work that we are doing is situated in South Africa. So as you saw at when you look at the title, it says South Africa contrasting the global north. So I'm not presenting doctoral models in South Africa, contrasting them to the global north. But what I am doing instead is looking at scholars who have been trained as doctoral students in the global south. A lot of them are in South Africa because South Africa is one of the largest doctoral hub in Africa. So then we are looking at South Africa as an analytical lens rather than a case study. I hope that makes sense. So as I say that South Africa attracts a lot of scholars from the neighboring countries, which is Kenya, West, Southern Africa. And through policy, South Africa, because of colonialism, takes a lot of policies and it models a lot from the global north in terms of how it executes its doctoral education. So a lot of the authors, although not South African, but they were trained in South Africa. So you'll hear when I speak about some of the stories that they've displayed in the chapters, why to them being in South Africa was more of a double process of experiencing epistemology in a different note. For instance, if you have a scholar from West Africa who speaks French, they have to come into South Africa where we largely use English. So that does a lot in terms of your contribution to knowledge, and I'll speak about that. So I'll just like to speak about briefly some of the models of doctoral education that we see in the global south. So the apprenticeship model, which we currently use in South Africa. And also please note that a lot of these doctoral models are there in paper. They're there in policies, but we tend to use this apprenticeship model. And I'll explain why. So this one is just you and your supervisor, and a lot of disadvantages with it is that you don't get to know the people that you are studying with. Like, for example, here at least you have people that you know that there's Ingbra that you're doing the doctoral education with. There are people that you're able to sit and have peer network. But for people who are doing their PhD in this model, it's just you and the supervisor, right? So with the coursework research model, we don't have a university that has coursework that is credit bearing. So when you are studying in South Africa in any of our 26 institutions, what you are currently doing is you have submitted your proposal, and it's just you and your supervisor. So if you do go to a seminar, maybe it's on research methods, a seminar on theoretical frameworks, that's just for you. It counts nothing towards your doctoral education. So we have cohort structured programs. So those mostly work when we have in South Africa what is called a CIHE. So if, for example, I'll make an example with you, Chris. If you have funding, let's say 12 million funding, and then you put out a call to say you want 3 doctoral students, those 3 students can then progress as a cohort because there's funding attached to that. And then we have the publication-based doctorate, right, where you write 3 to 4 papers, and there's your PhD. As much as we have this on paper and on policy, but there's a lot of hesitancy to use it because of some of the issues that I'm going to speak about of what it means to get a doctoral education or a doctorate in the Global South. So now, how does the Global North function here? As I said, that the Global North is not a case study, but it is a benchmark that a lot of universities in the Global South use to determine whether you are worthy as a doctoral holder or not. So this includes theoretical frameworks, citation practices, it includes publication expectations. And what do I mean about that is that when you are doing a doctoral in South Africa, most of the time you're going to get a backlash if you're mostly using Global South theory. If you're not citing any Global North, they're going to tell you that your study is not international enough. We have a Council of Higher Education that looks at issues of quality when it comes to doctoral education. So they have a provision to say that a lot of the doctoral theses have to be externally examined. So a lot of universities then produce and also look at what does that external mean. For a lot of the South African institutions, external doesn't mean you're going to send it to Nigeria, Kenya, or so forth. It means you send it to one of the institutions in the Global North. And what that does, it says that, for example, if I'm writing about a community you know nothing about, you don't know the context, you are sitting as a Global North examiner. You have the responsibility to endorse what you do not know. And in most cases, the feedback that we get is that the studies are not relatable in an international scale. But you find that what was meant to be a system that's used to ensure quality, benchmarking, has become a system to control knowledge. And that is where I'm coming from. So when we also use best practices in doctoral training, so even with publishing, you are not expected to publish in our local journals. So if I'm writing solely about a community in South Africa, I don't think that if I approach studies in higher education, that will be the right way to go because it's an international journal and what I'm writing about is quite local, right? So those are some of the practices that we see. So now that creates a real tension where for the longest of time, the Global North has been positioned as a space of theory, right, where conceptual innovation and universal frameworks are being done. And the Global South has been then situated as a space where we test these theoretical frameworks. So I'll just pick up on a conversation we once had with Rebecca when we were just talking about this issue to say, in the Global South, what people mostly do is that we take theoretical frameworks and we test them in South Africa and then we say that's contribution to knowledge. In her books, she said that that's not contribution to knowledge because what you're purely doing is taking something that's already being defined and you're just testing it. the only contributions at different contexts. And for the longest of time, if that is what is expected of the global south, then what does it mean to contribute to the body of knowledge if we are just waiting for the global north to produce theoretical frameworks and we are just testing? So this is the real question and the real tension that the book that I am speaking about is answering. What does it mean to contribute to knowledge in a global south doctoral system shaped by colonial histories and global north expectations, right? And this is still a thing that happens in nowadays. So I asked each and every author to then reflect on their doctoral journey. What was the contribution that the doctoral journey or the doctoral education in itself had? And when I read most of the chapters, you see that there's a different concept of what contribution means, and also there's a lot of hurdles that they had to overcome to actually say that this is a contribution to knowledge. So I'll just like to speak about the different ways in which we see contribution to knowledge. So different fields honor different things. So if you're writing in a quantitative way, you're going to take a positivist approach, and it's about measurements, right? When you're in a field where you're interpreting, it's about your conceptual reframing. Then in a decolonial field, it's about epistemic disobedience. So this means that it's not just about taking knowledge, but it is about questioning the knowledge. So the feminist is all about standpoint clarity and methodology. And then we find with policy fields, it's all about practicality. So some of these authors, because also we need to be aware that these are not doctoral students in higher education. So some of them come from the maths field, and contribution to maths is very different to what contribution is in our social sciences. Now I want to speak about who decides a study's contribution. Firstly, the researcher proposes it. When you're having a proposal, you say, what is the gap? What is the research problem? And then it's the scholarly community that validates that stand, and then power structures within the knowledge system shape it. So the final point about this is that contribution is claimed by the researcher, but recognized by the community. So I cannot just come and say something crazy and then say that is a contribution. It has to be validated. So I'm also going to speak of some of the hurdles that these authors had to face, and I'll also say my positionality as the editor of the book, some of the hurdles that I had to also face in order to have this. So the book is written by Global South authors. I think I should have said this at the beginning, using Global South theories and Global South experiences, right? That on its own was a contestation in 2025. So I always hear that my first year students always say that I have weird slides. As you can see, this is like a cascade of staircases, but they tend to enjoy that, right? So some of the emerging sites that now we see in the book project is that some speak about the collective knowledge making. I'm going to get into depth about these four. And some speak about doctoral labor as epistemic work, embodied and situated epistemologies, relational and ethical knowledge making. So let's start with the first epistemic signature, which is collective knowledge making. So I said earlier on that a lot of these doctoral students are trained through an apprentice model, just a supervisor and yourself. So some students got together and they created what we call a community of practice, where it's just an informal network of people coming for a particular goal. Their goal was to finish their doctoral education. So these doctoral holders are from different universities, different fields, so they would have monthly meetings, check-ins to keep themselves accountable. And why they had this is that they were also studying during a time where it was COVID. You couldn't have face-to-face interaction. They didn't have even their graduation. Everything was just online. So they saw doctoral education not as a solitary journey, as the apprentice model shapes it. Because we hear that when we read a lot of higher education literature, when we look at what are some of the hurdles we see in doctoral education, is that we find that there's a lot of isolation, mental health issues, and so forth. So this peer support structure, this community of practice that they created, was there to ensure that no one gets left behind, and in the difficult time of COVID, that they were able to finish what they actually started. So now the second point, I think I pointed this out. So we had one author who spoke about embodied and situated epistemology. So he's from the West African country, and he speaks mostly French. He's not really fluent with English, so everything has to be translated. With translation, a lot of meaning gets lost. I know that even with my own home language, when I have to translate into English, you lose the meaning. So what does that mean for him in his intellectual contribution? So you find that post-colonial French has its own educational lineage, local knowledge systems from their own home countries, because he was writing about his country whilst he's based in South Africa. The supervisor is South African, does not understand what he's talking about. So his French academic writing norms are very different to ours. And other things that he spoke about is that his body then became a site of translation, cultural, linguistic, and academic. Whether we like it or not, when we are talking most times, we always make reference to something that is cultural, something that's linguistic, that anyone could understand. But with him, he fell short of some of those explanations because he would speak from his context that is not understood in South Africa. Another thing that he was navigating was accent, code switching, being misunderstood. And this came because in South Africa, there's a lot of xenophobic attacks, even currently, where there has been hostility towards welcoming other Africans in the country. So those were one other things where I say even at the end that he was African enough to be local, but he was too African to be international. So there's this thing, as I said earlier, that Africans, when they look at other African countries, we look at them as regional countries and not international. And also that is why even with our doctoral examination, it's not regarded international when you send your thesis to be examined to another African country. And I don't know why. So these are some of the things that he reflected on. So the third one, which I also found interesting. So this was a lady who worked as a domestic worker as she was getting her doctoral degree. So she was doing it in social work. I know nothing about social work. But what became interesting is that her work became an epistemic standpoint for her to understand what care and absence is, because some of the details of being a domestic worker, you give care to the kids and so forth, and that gave her a standpoint to speak about the field of social work. So she reinterpreted resilience by individual coping. So this is not like a soapy story that, oh, I come from a poor background and so forth, but she used that as a way to inform knowledge and as a way to have a contribution conceptually. And also she's a first generation. I think she's the first one to have a degree at home, so I found it quite interesting. And the fourth one, which is ethics. So this particular individuals, because there's a lot of them, they were reflecting about the ethical, like getting the ethics approved, right? So let's start with what ethics normally requires. Let's start with that. So it's individual consent rather. One person, so if you are going to collect data, you get that individual consent, privacy and autonomy as the central principles. It's normally research-led, interviews with structured questionings, and there's a lot of participant independence. But this does not work when you go to a lot of the African communities. Firstly, where this fell is that many communities operate through collective consent. So if you're going to go to a space that is not led through a political party, but rather there is like a king there, and we have a lot of those places in Africa, you have to go through the chief, the elders, and even the family. They become the gatekeepers. So our institutions teach us that when you want a gatekeeper's letter, you write an email and sit in your office. But here you have to build a rapport. You have to have a relationship with the community in order for them to trust you, right? So secondly, voices are mediated. So if you're a woman or a younger person, in some communities you cannot speak. You speak through the chief or that leader. So the researcher then is not the one leading the interviews, but rather it is a chief. There's also another paper I read, I think I'll recommend it, where one lady went to collect data in Tanzania, and she reflected on how some of these issues shaped how she thinks about the ethics of getting research. And then authority structures shape access, so timing and what can be said. So in most cases, we say that whatever you say as the one being interviewed is autonomous and so forth, but it doesn't work in a community, because sometimes you find you go into a community and they are not as free and open to speak, especially if you're doing focus groups. So if you have a community leader there, no one from the community is going to speak until the leader does. So there's a lot of hierarchy also in how you collect the data. So also relational ethics matter more than individual autonomy. So you have to make relations with the people, and you go far beyond the duty of just being a researcher. Because I think a lot of our research work makes us to extract from communities. But what a lot of African contexts really requires for you to have a relational base before you can even collect data. So what we see is that Western ethics don't really reflect how knowledge is actually accessed in these community contexts. So this is one of the contributions. So then just to think about moving forward, expanding what counts as knowledge. After everything that I've said, after everything that I've presented, is that we have to rethink what originality is. Given that our contexts are not the same, given that how we access data is not the same, and how we produce knowledge is not the same, we cannot have just a one way of saying originality means reaching northern standards, because we are not experiencing knowledge from the northern standards. So we have to rethink what rigor is, because to collect data from an African community is rigorous enough, as I explained. It's not just printing forms and sending in consent forms. You have to go and make a relationship. So that also has a bearing in terms of time to degree. So how long it takes for you to actually finish your degree. So rethinking legitimacy. So scholars must be able to contribute from their contexts without leaving their contexts and entirely to external standards, because sometimes it's impossible. So my reflections now as the editor of the book is that editing the book revealed the politics of who's allowed to produce knowledge. And I think because when I sat down to write the proposal and send the proposal to all these publishing houses, being mainly the northern publishing houses, is that I was questioned that the book is written by the Global South experiences, and the theories are Global South. And there was even, the first publishing house rejected the proposal, then we sent it to another publishing house. And we had a back and forth until they recently accepted the proposal. But even that back and forth was a learning curve for me, because some of the things that they were questioning are things that means we need some sort of gatekeeping and authority in order for us to write. So for me, finding a publisher was difficult because the book centers Global South epistemologies without Northern validation. And then thirdly, the volume is a deliberate decolonial intervention, right? Because it's not about saying global theories are wrong, but it's more opening the world up to say we are in two different thinking worlds. Sometimes what is expected from the Global South is impossible because of all the conditions that I've just displayed. And fourthly, the book affirms that the Global South does not need permission to theorize itself. So we don't need to be aliens of our own knowledge in order for us to contribute. But we're able to contribute, because I always say when I'm joking with my colleagues, is that sometimes we read papers of cities and communities we know nothing about, but we take that as knowledge. So the same could be done with the Global South, where you can read about a community you know nothing about, but still accept that as knowledge. And a lot of this I even see in some of the papers that we have to work on corrections on, is that if you don't cite certain northern scholars, which sometimes is difficult, because if I'm writing about African ethics, it's very hard to cite a northern scholar, right? So it becomes very limiting, and it becomes also draining to be able to be a producer. So for me, this is not rather a lens to say that let's just go AWOL, but rather it's to say let's expand the scope of what it means to contribute knowledge, and let's expand the scope of understanding what it means to actually get to the doctoral journey. And I think I'm done.